The email arrived on a Tuesday, in the middle of tax season, from a title company I'd never heard of, addressed to Nora Castellan, a name I hadn't used since my wedding, asking me to confirm my forwarding address for a disbursement related to the sale of 1148 Chautauqua Lane. My name is Nora Castellan. I'm 42 years old, a CPA with my own small practice in Denver, and 1148 Chautauqua Lane was my parents' house, the house I had wired $200,000 towards 6 years earlier. The house I had never once been asked to sign off on selling. I read the email 3 times before I understood it wasn't a mistake. I called my mother. She answered on the 4th ring, breathless in the particular way she gets when she's been caught doing something and needs a second to arrange her voice. "Oh, honey, I was going to call you this week," she said, and something in my chest went very still, the way a room goes still right before you realize the sound you heard was glass breaking somewhere you couldn't see. "Mom, did you sell the house?" "We're downsizing, sweetheart. You know your father's knees can't do the stairs anymore." A pause, too smooth, too rehearsed. "It's been in the works for months." "Where's my $200,000, Mom?" The silence on the other end lasted exactly long enough for me to understand, before she said a single word, that I already knew the answer, and that I was going to hate hearing her say it out loud. "We helped your brother," she said. "Nora, he needed it more than the money needed to sit in an account waiting for something." I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed so hard against my ear it would leave a mark, and felt the floor of my entire adult life quietly, invisibly, give way beneath me. To understand how I ended up standing in that kitchen, you have to understand what our family was for as long as I can remember. A system, carefully balanced, in which my brother Ryan was the sun and the rest of us were very good. Very devoted planets. It wasn't cruel, not on the surface. My parents never said, out loud, that Ryan mattered more. They didn't have to. It showed up in smaller ways, the way water shows up first as damp on a ceiling before it ever becomes a leak, in who got the extra scoop of praise at dinner, in whose failures were just a rough patch and whose were character flaws, in the fact that I was the one who learned, early, to need very little, because needing little was the only way to stay comfortably inside a family that had already decided where its resources were going. I built my life around being the reliable one. I got my CPA license at 26, married Mark, a structural engineer with a laugh that fills a room and absolutely no patience for my family's quiet math, had 2 kids, and built a small accounting practice that, 6 years ago, had finally started making real money. That was the year my parents called about the house. Their mortgage was underwater after a bad refinance, the kind my father, a retired contractor, had talked himself into believing was a smart move at the time. They needed $200,000 to keep the house I'd grown up in, the house that still smelled like my mother's Sunday bread if you stood in the right hallway at the right hour. I didn't hesitate. That's the part one want to be honest about, because it matters for everything that came after. I didn't need convincing. I wired the money within a week, out of an inheritance from my grandmother that I'd been sitting on, quietly proud of myself for being the daughter who could finally give something back instead of just receiving. I did ask, at the time, whether we should draw up something formal, a lien, a promissory note, anything, and my mother had laughed, warm and a little wounded, and said, "Nora, we're family. You don't need paperwork with family." My father had nodded along, and something in me, some small accountant's voice that spends its whole life reading the fine print on other people's decisions, went quiet and let it go, because arguing felt like accusing them of something none of us wanted named. I did have Mark draft something anyway, a simple 1-page loan acknowledgement, nothing binding sounding, just a record, and I mailed it to them for my files, and my mother signed it at the kitchen table, distracted. The way you sign a form at the pharmacy without reading it, and I filed it away and told myself it would probably never matter. For 6 years, it didn't come up. I want you to understand that this wasn't secrecy on anyone's part. Exactly, the money simply became part of the house the way a coat of paint becomes part of a wall. I never once thought about needing it back. I thought about it the way you think about a gift you've given freely, gone, transformed, no longer yours to track. If I'm honest about the small, buried unease of those years, It wasn't about money at all. It was about Ryan. Ryan is 38, 4 years younger than me, and for most of our childhood, he was the kind of charming that made forgiveness automatic. The boy who could total a car and somehow leave the conversation feeling like the family had learned something about themselves. Not about him. He went through 3 business ventures in his 20s, each one funded partly by our parents, each one ending the same way: a graceful collapse, a lesson learned, a fresh start funded again. I used to tell myself this was just how youngest children were treated, a little softer landing, nothing sinister in it. I told myself that at Ryan's wedding, watching my parents pay for the open bar after telling me, 2 years earlier, that they really couldn't help with mine. I told myself that at Christmas, watching my mother's face light up differently for his gifts than for mine, a difference so small most people wouldn't have clocked it, but I had spent a lifetime studying that face for information. And I knew its weather better than I knew my own. There was a dinner, maybe 8 months before the house sold, where my sister-in-law Beth had a second glass of wine and said, lightly, almost as a joke, "Your parents talk about Ryan's new restaurant idea like it's already a done deal." I remember laughing along. I remember thinking, of course they do, that's just Ryan. That's just how it's always been, and filing the comment away in the same drawer where I'd filed Harold's, where I'd filed every small, dismissible thing, the drawer marked not my problem to solve. That drawer, I would learn later, had been quietly filling for years. 2 months before the title company's email, my mother called to say my father wanted to simplify things now that his knees were bad, and mentioned, in the same breath as talk of grab bars and physical therapy, that they'd started looking at listings, just to see what's out there. I said that sounded sensible. I didn't think, even once, to ask whether that meant selling the house I'd put $200,000 into 6 years earlier. Why would I? It was still, in my mind, simply their house. The loan had folded itself so completely into the fabric of the family that I'd stopped being able to see the seam. Looking back now, that's exactly the moment I should have asked the question I spent years not asking. It wasn't hidden from me. I simply wasn't looking, because looking would have meant admitting the arrangement had never been as safe as I needed it to be. I noticed things in the weeks after, small things I didn't think much of at the time. My mother stopped mentioning Ryan's restaurant plans on our calls, after months of talking about almost nothing else, a subject she'd normally have run into the ground, gone quiet, the way a person goes quiet about something they've already decided, rather than something that's fallen away naturally. My father, usually the one who called me for tax advice every March like clockwork, hadn't called once that season, and when I asked if he needed help with anything, he said, too quickly, no, we're all squared away this year, in a tone that had never once, in 42 years, applied to my father and taxes. And Beth, who texted me constantly, who'd been closer to me some years than my own mother, went quiet for almost 3 weeks. When I finally called her, she sounded strange, distracted, ending the call faster than usual, saying something vague about a busy month with the kids. I didn't push. I told myself everyone gets busy. I told myself this the way I'd told myself 100 small things over the years, each one small enough to swallow on its own, none of them alone, worth choking on. I want to stop here for a second, because if you've ever noticed something was off and decided, quietly, that you'd rather not know what it meant, you already understand exactly what those weeks felt like. Not suspicion, exactly. Just a low hum underneath ordinary life, the kind you can only hear if you stop moving long enough to listen, and I had built an entire adulthood out of not stopping. Sometime that same month, Mark noticed I'd started double-checking our own mortgage statements at odd hours, a habit I couldn't fully explain even to myself. "You okay?" he asked once, watching me stare at a spreadsheet that had nothing to do with anything. I said I was fine. I wasn't lying exactly. I just didn't yet have the words for the thing I could feel coming, the way you can feel weather change in a joint that was broken once, long before the sky gives you any actual reason to believe it. The last ordinary dinner happened 3 weeks before the email. My parents, Ryan, Beth, and their kids came to our place for a Sunday cookout, and it was, on its surface, exactly like every other Sunday cookout of my adult life. My father telling the same 3 stories about his contracting days. My mother fussing over whether the kids had eaten enough vegetables, Ryan holding court about some new venture, this one a boutique fitness studio, with the easy confidence of a man who has never once had to build something entirely on his own credit. I remember my mother pulling me aside near the grill, ostensibly to ask about a recipe, and instead saying, apropos of nothing, "You've always been so good with money, Nora. So responsible." I remember how warm that felt in the moment, how much I wanted it to be a compliment and nothing more, and how, even as I smiled and said thank you, some small cold part of me, the part that reads fine print for a living, noted that my mother rarely gave out praise without using it for something shortly after. She didn't ask me for anything that night. I want to be clear about that, because I've turned this dinner over so many times since, looking for the moment she should have told me, and there wasn't one. That's what I understand now that I didn't understand then. The telling had already happened, weeks earlier, to someone else. I was simply the last person in the family scheduled to find out. The week after the title company's email, I drove to Boulder without calling ahead, which is not something I do. I have spent my whole life calling ahead, giving people time to arrange themselves before I arrive, and some old, sharpened part of me wanted, for once, to see my parents' faces before they'd had time to build the version of the story they wanted me to hear. The house had a sold sign in the yard, and through the front window I could see it half emptied, boxes stacked in the living room where the piano used to be. My mother opened the door already talking, already smoothing. "Nora, honey, I wish you'd called. We're in such a state," and I stood on the porch of the house I'd helped save and said, "Where is my money, Mom?" Not the story. The number and where it went. She let me in. My father was in the kitchen, and I watched him not look at me directly, occupying himself with a coffee maker that clearly needed no attention, and something in that avoidance told me more than anything either of them said in the next 20 minutes. The story, when it finally came, arrived in pieces, each one offered like it should soften the last. Ryan's fitness studio needed capital fast, a lease he'd have lost otherwise. The house sale had already been in motion, so it made sense, financially, to fold the two things together. They'd meant to talk to me about it properly, but the timeline moved faster than expected, and they didn't want to worry me during tax season. My mother said this last part like it was a kindness, as if not telling me my own money had been given away was an act of consideration rather than theft. "There's a document," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "I have your signature on a loan acknowledgement. You signed it at the kitchen table. I mailed it to you." My mother's face did something I'd genuinely never seen it do before, a flicker of real uncertainty, quickly papered over. "Nora, that was just a formality. Your father and I never thought of it as a real loan. It was your money to give, not to lend. It has an amount and a date and both your signatures on it, Mom." She looked at my father. He still hadn't turned around. "We'll figure something out," she said, in the tone she used to use when I was a child and had scraped a knee that clearly needed stitches, the tone meant to end a conversation, not resolve it. I left without raising my voice. I remember sitting in my car outside the house for almost 10 minutes before I could make myself drive, my hands not quite steady on the wheel, my heart doing something fast and wrong in my chest that I recognized, distantly, as the same feeling I got before difficult client audits, the body knowing, before the mind fully catches up, that something large and irreversible has just begun. I didn't know it then. This is what my mother was carrying, in her own words, from around that same week. I told myself Nora would understand, eventually, because Nora always understood. That's what I told Richard too. She's the reasonable one. She'll see the bigger picture. Ryan's whole life would have collapsed if that lease fell through, and Nora's life was already solid, already safe, and I genuinely believed, in the moment I signed the papers redirecting the proceeds, that I was simply moving water from a full well to an empty one. I didn't think of it as taking anything from her. I thought of it as finally, for once, doing for Ryan what I hadn't had to do for Nora, because Nora had never once, her whole life, needed rescuing. I didn't let myself think about what that actually meant about the two of them, what it said about which of my children I trusted to survive being loved less carefully. I'm back now, standing in my kitchen a week later, holding a phone with my daughter's voice on it, sounding like someone I didn't fully recognize. I called Harold Voss. Not my Harold Voss, I didn't have one, but a family law and estate attorney named Priscilla Ames, recommended by a client whose divorce I'd handled the accounting for years earlier. I told her everything: the wire, the acknowledgement, the sale, the silence. She asked me to send her the document. "This isn't nothing, Nora," she said, after reading it. "A signed acknowledgement with a specific amount and both their signatures is a real instrument, even if it's informal. Depending on how the sale proceeds were dispersed, you may have a legitimate claim against the estate or against them directly, while they're both living." I asked her what that would mean, practically. She said it would mean, if I chose to pursue it, formal demand letters, possibly a civil suit, possibly a lien against remaining assets. She said the word lawsuit the way professionals say difficult words to clients, plainly, without flinching, letting the weight land where it needed to. I told her I needed to think. What I actually needed was time to decide whether I was the kind of daughter who could do this to her own parents, and I want to be honest that for the first week after that meeting, I genuinely didn't know the answer. I began, quietly, the way I approach any audit, methodically, without announcing what I was doing to anyone in the family. I requested the closing disclosure from the title company, using my name still listed as a lien holder adjacent party from years of handling my parents' taxes. I pulled the original loan acknowledgement from my files and had it notarized as a certified copy. I asked Mark, gently, not to mention any of this to his side of the family, who occasionally crossed paths with mine at shared events. The closing disclosure, when it arrived, told me exactly what I needed and more than I wanted to know. The house had sold for $612,000. After the remaining mortgage and closing costs, the net proceeds were just over $380,000. Of that, according to a wire confirmation Priscilla helped me subpoena informally through a paralegal contact before we'd even filed anything, $350,000 had gone directly into an account belonging to Ryan's Fitness Studio LLC, dated 4 days before the closing on my parents' house. They hadn't waited for the sale at all. They'd used a bridge loan against the pending sale to get Ryan his money faster, meaning the decision to give him everything, including my $200,000, had been made and executed before my parents had even told me the house was for sale. I sat with that printout at my kitchen table long after Mark and the kids had gone to bed, and felt something in me go very cold and very clear, the way water goes when it's finally reached the exact temperature to freeze. This wasn't a hasty mistake made under pressure. It was a plan, executed in order, with me positioned last, not because my money mattered least, but because I was the one least likely to make a scene about finding out late. I called Beth 2 days later, mostly out of habit, and something in her voice when she answered, too bright, too fast, made me ask, directly, "Did you know about this before I did?" The silence lasted long enough to answer the question on its own. "Ryan told me the money was coming a few weeks before the closing," she finally said. "I didn't know the details. I swear, Nora, I didn't know it was your $200,000 specifically, not until," she stopped herself. "Until when, Beth?" "Until your mom mentioned it to me last week. Asked me not to say anything until they'd sorted it out with you." I didn't say anything for a moment, letting that sit between us, the fact that my sister-in-law had known, for over a week, before the title company's email ever reached me, and had chosen, deliberately, to say nothing. "I have to go," I said, and I did, and I didn't call her back for a long time after that. I had, by then, the closing disclosure, the wire confirmation, and the signed loan acknowledgement, 3 separate documents that, laid together, told a story no one in my family could talk their way around. I didn't tell my parents I had them. I didn't tell Ryan. I put the folder in a drawer in my home office, told Priscilla I wanted to prepare a formal demand letter, but hold it until I decided how I wanted this handled, and went back to acting at family gatherings almost exactly like myself. That was the hardest part, if I'm honest, not the gathering, but the waiting. Sitting across from my mother at a birthday dinner 2 weeks later, watching her laugh at something Ryan said, holding a folder's worth of quiet, documented certainty and saying nothing, because I understood by then that the moment I said something, I would lose the only advantage I'd ever really had in this family, The fact that no one had ever once needed to worry about what I might do. If you've ever sat across a table from someone, knowing something they don't know, you understand exactly how loud that silence gets and how much it costs to hold. I asked my parents to meet at their new condo, alone, no Ryan, no Beth, framing it as wanting to talk things through properly, language soft enough that my mother agreed immediately, relieved, I think, to believe the worst had already passed. They'd arranged the small living room the way my mother arranges every room before a difficult conversation, good lighting, her favorite chair positioned to receive rather than defend. A plate of cookies on the coffee table, as if hospitality could preempt an accusation. My father sat beside her, hands folded, wearing the expression he'd worn my entire childhood before delivering a lecture about responsibility, as though he still believed, walking into this room, that he was the one holding the moral high ground. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I set 3 documents on the coffee table, beside the untouched cookies, and turned each one to face them. The notarized loan acknowledgement with both their signatures, the closing disclosure, the wire confirmation dated 4 days before closing. "I'm not here to argue," I said. "I'm here to tell you what happens next." My mother's eyes moved across the documents, and I watched her calculate, in real time, which version of the story might still survive contact with paper. "Nora, we can talk about repayment, obviously, in time, once things settle with Ryan's business. This isn't about repayment on your timeline," I said. "This is a documented loan. I have a legal claim, and I intend to pursue it formally, starting this week." My father's composure cracked first, but not into remorse, into something sharper. "You're going to sue your own parents? Over money we needed to keep your brother's family afloat?" His voice rose, filling the small room the way it used to fill our old kitchen when I was young enough to still flinch at it. "After everything we did for you, Nora, the wedding, You didn't pay for my wedding," I said, evenly. "You told me you couldn't help, 6 weeks before Ryan's, which you paid for in full." "That's not the point," my mother snapped, and I watched, almost with detachment, as the conversation tilted exactly the way I'd expected it might, away from the documents, toward me, toward every old grievance they could locate quickly enough to use. "You've always kept score, Nora. Even as a child. Your brother needed help and you're punishing an entire family over a number." "I'm not punishing anyone. I'm asking for my money back." I kept my voice level, though something in my chest had begun, finally, to shake, not visibly, not yet, just a low tremor beneath the surface, the accumulated weight of a lifetime of swallowed questions finally pressing against a door I'd decided, that day, to stop holding shut. "You've always been the one who couldn't just give," my father said, and something in that sentence, the casual, practiced cruelty of it, dressed up as a simple observation, was, oddly, the thing that finally reached whatever was left of my composure. "I gave $200,000, I said, and my voice, for the first time that afternoon, wasn't level anymore. "I gave it because you asked, because I believed we didn't need paperwork with family, because I have spent 42 years believing that being needed less than Ryan meant I was simply stronger, not that I mattered less. You didn't run out of time to tell me before the sale. You ran out of reasons to keep pretending you were ever going to." The room went very quiet. My mother's hands, I noticed, had gone still in her lap, not composed, still, the particular stillness of someone who has just heard something they cannot immediately find a way around. My father spoke again after a long moment, and this time something in his voice had changed, not soft exactly, but exposed, the practiced defense finally running out of road. "You want to know the truth," he said. "Fine. I'll tell you the truth." He finally spoke. This is what he told me, almost word for word, because I've replayed it enough times since that I don't think I could forget it if I tried. "When your grandfather died and left me nothing but his tools and a stack of unpaid bills, I told myself I was going to build something my kids would never have to worry about the way I worried. And for a long time I thought I had the business, the house, all of it. Then it started slipping, slower than you'd think a life can slip, and by the time we needed that $200,000 from you, I'd already spent years quietly terrified that I was becoming exactly the man my father was. Someone who couldn't hold up what he'd built. You never asked me for anything, Nora. Not once, your whole adult life. And somewhere in there, I think I decided that meant you didn't need me, which meant helping you didn't feel like being a father in the same way that helping Ryan did. Ryan needed rescuing constantly, and every time I rescued him, some part of me got to feel, for a minute, like the man I used to be before everything started going sideways. When the fitness studio deal came up, and the lease was about to fall through, I told your mother it made sense to move fast, to fold it into the house sale, because waiting felt like losing him the same way I'd almost lost the business twice before. I didn't think about what it would cost you, because I had trained myself over years not to think about you as someone who could be cost anything. You always seemed fine, always seemed like you'd land on your feet no matter what we did. I told myself, right up until you walked in today, that you'd understand eventually, because you always understood everything else. He stopped. Nobody said anything for a moment. It wasn't an apology, not really, not once did he say the word sorry, but it was the most honest thing my father had said to me in my entire adult life, and some old part of me, the part that had spent 42 years wanting exactly this kind of clarity from him, felt something crack open that had nothing to do with the money at all. My mother, watching my father speak, had gone very quiet, and I understood, from the specific stillness in her face, that she was hearing something in his confession that she hadn't fully let herself hear before either, the shape of her own complicity, standing next to his. I let it happen, she finally said, quietly, not to me exactly, more to the room. I told myself I was being fair, in some larger sense, evening out a lifetime of things Ryan never had that Nora did. I never once asked whether that was actually true, or whether I just needed it to be, because the alternative was admitting I'd spent 30 years loving one of my children more easily than the other. It wasn't forgiveness, what passed through me in that moment. It was something smaller and stranger, recognition, maybe, of two people finally saying a true thing out loud, decades too late to undo any of the damage the silence had already done. I stood up. I still expect the demand letter to be honored, I said. That doesn't change. But I wanted you to know I heard that. And then I left, before either of them could turn the moment into something it wasn't. The lawsuit never actually needed to go to trial. Priscilla's formal demand letter, backed by the wire confirmation and the notarized acknowledgement, arrived on my parents' attorney's desk within a week of the confrontation, and within 6 weeks. Facing the very real possibility of a judgment against remaining retirement assets, they agreed to a structured settlement, full repayment of the $200,000 secured against their retirement accounts over 18 months. Formalized this time with real paperwork drafted by real lawyers, the kind my mother had once called unnecessary between family. Ryan's fitness studio failed anyway, 11 months later, for reasons that had nothing to do with the money that had built it and everything to do with a business plan that had never quite made sense in the first place. He called me once, during that collapse, in a tone I hadn't heard from him before, smaller, uncertain, and asked, almost sheepishly, whether I could help him look at the numbers. I told him I could recommend an accountant. I didn't offer to be that accountant myself. Something in me had finally, permanently, stopped being available for that particular role in his life, and I felt, saying no, not triumphant, just quietly, finally, free of an old weight I hadn't fully realized I was still carrying. Beth and I never fully recovered. We're cordial now at family events, the way people are cordial when a friendship has ended, but the family logistics haven't allowed for a clean break. I don't think she ever fully understood why her silence cost her what it did. I've stopped trying to explain it to her. My parents finished repaying the loan on schedule. My mother has said, more than once since, some version of, I hope we can move past this now, and I've told her, each time, gently but clearly, that we can move forward without pretending it never happened, which is a different thing than moving past it. My father has never brought it up again directly, though he calls more often now than he used to, and asks, sometimes, about my work in a way that sounds, for the first time in my life, like genuine curiosity rather than a formality he's performing. I still think, sometimes, about the version of myself who sat in Boulder Sunday mornings as a child, filing away small unfairnesses because naming them felt more dangerous than carrying them. I don't fully blame her. She was doing the only math she knew how to do at the time. But I'm glad now that I finally learned there was another equation available, one where being loved and being valued were allowed to be the same thing, and where I no longer had to earn either one by needing nothing at all. The cruelest arithmetic in this story was never the $200,000, it was the decades-long calculation, made silently by both parents, that Nora's steadiness made her safe to shortchange, while Ryan's instability made him worth continually rescuing. That single distorted equation, more than any single lie, explains almost everything that happened, not just the sale of the house, but the years of small, dismissible signals that preceded it, none of which Nora misreads so much as declined to add up. Because doing the math honestly would have meant confronting a truth about her own value in the family long before there was a lawsuit to make it undeniable. What the story reveals about competence is worth sitting with. Nora's strength, her calm, her financial discipline, her instinct to handle things quietly, was never separate from the harm done to her. It was the very quality her parents relied on to get away with it for as long as they did. Families rarely exploit their most fragile members financially. They exploit their most capable ones, because capable people absorb damage without demanding immediate acknowledgement. Richard's confession, when it finally came, didn't excuse the theft, but it did explain the mechanism. A father who had quietly decided, without ever examining the decision, that only the child who seemed to need rescuing deserved the full weight of his attention, while the child who never asked for help became, paradoxically, the one it was safest to take from. The story's real turning point wasn't the confrontation itself, but the wire confirmation dated 4 days before closing, the detail that proved this wasn't a hurried mistake, but a sequence, planned and executed with Nora positioned last on purpose. Once that timeline became visible, forgiveness stopped being a live option, because forgiveness requires believing you were an oversight, not a calculation. There's a quieter question worth asking, one the story never answers directly. How many families are organized around exactly this kind of unspoken ledger, one child treated as bottomless and one as fragile? And how much of that arrangement only survives because the bottomless one has learned never to ask for a balance? That question doesn't end with Nora's settlement. It's still sitting unresolved at every kitchen table where someone has decided that being needed less is the same thing as being loved enough. What stays with me most from Nora's story isn't the lawsuit, or even her father's confession. It's the 6 years she spent not asking a single question about a house she'd helped save. Because asking would have meant admitting the arrangement was never as solid as she needed it to be. I think most of us have at least one version of that drawer, the place where we file the comment, the missed call, the small unfairness we've decided isn't worth the conversation it would take to name. Here's the quiet question I'd leave you with. Is there a number, a document, a family arrangement in your own life that you've agreed, without ever quite deciding to, not to look at too closely? You don't have to answer that out loud, but it might be worth answering to yourself. If someone in your family has ever made you feel like the strong one who simply didn't need looking after, I'd love to hear, in one word in the comments, what that cost you. Thank you for staying with Nora's story all the way to the end. It means more than you know to have it heard.